Well, welcome everybody. Welcome to the Tower Center here at SMU for our program tonight on the TPP and our very interesting speaker, Mr. Michael Beeman. I'm Josh Rover. I'm the acting director here at the center. It's my great pleasure to welcome everybody here. Special thanks for all of you for coming tonight. It's a special thanks also to the Japan America Society for all of their support. I will be very brief. My mission is just to say hello and welcome you. I will turn it over to my colleague, Professor Hiroki Takeuchi, who will get the program rolling by introducing our speaker. Michael Beeman will give his thoughts for about 20 minutes, half an hour, 20 minutes, okay. And then we'll open it up to Q&A. And I think we have a great topic. I think we should have a really lively discussion tonight. It's an issue which is not going away anytime soon. With that, I will turn it over to my colleague, Dr. Takeuchi.
Welcome to the Tower Center TPP Symposium. TPP is a very important topic. And this symposium discusses the implications of the TPP beyond economics. And actually, it's not just myself who is saying that. In April 2015, in his speech to the U.S. Congress, Japanese Prime Minister Shinzo Abe said the TPP goes far beyond just economic benefits. It is also about our security. Long term, its strategic value is awesome. Also, U.S. Defense Secretary Ashton Carter stated, passing TPP is as important to me as another aircraft carrier. So it's very rare, unusual for a Defense Secretary to talk about international economic agreement. So the TPP has at least two implications beyond economics. I would say one is strategic, the other is security. Both implications are interestingly related to China, although China is not one of the negotiating countries of the current TPP. So strategically, the TPP is economic rule-making in international politics. So the conclusion of the TPP would enable the United States to impose the pressure on China by creating a yes or no choice to our rules to China. In the meantime, the failure of the TPP would make the United States in the difficult position facing China's challenge to the international rule of law without our rules. TPP also has security implication. Currently, China's leadership is divided between the reformist internationalists and the conservative hardliners. So the TPP would empower the reformists and make China's foreign policy more cooperative. In the meantime, the failure of the TPP would empower the conservatives in China's domestic politics and make China's foreign policy more aggressive. So that's what I would call the security implication of the TPP. So again, the TPP is important, and I cannot imagine the better person to talk about the TPP than tonight's speaker, Dr. Michael Beeman. Until October 2014, Dr. Beeman served as acting assistant U.S. trade representative for Japan, Korea, and APEC affairs. As a Japan specialist, fluent in Japanese language, he originally joined the office of the USTR in 2004 as Director for Japan Affairs and subsequently served as Deputy Assistant USTR for Japan from 2007 to 2013. Based in Washington, D.C., he is currently consulting the U.S. Chamber of Commerce and acting as a senior advisor to the U.S.-Japan Business Council. However, perhaps most importantly, he graduated from SMU. He received a BA from SMU in 1988. Then he received an MA from Johns Hopkins University and a PhD in political science from Oxford University. He wrote a dissertation about Japanese political economy. So for our students, I would say he's a role model. And so many of my students tell me that they want to work for international relations and public policy. I advise them to study political science and international affairs while mastering the foreign language. So when we are celebrating, the SMU is currently celebrating centennial, I am delighted to introduce today's speaker, Dr. Michael Beeman. So please welcome Dr. Beeman.
Thank you very much, Hiroki and Josh, for the kind invitation, the welcome and introduction. Ladies and gentlemen, it's a real pleasure to be back. As was mentioned, I am in fact an SMU graduate, and actually what I haven't shared with these gentlemen is the fact that not only am I an SMU graduate, both my parents are SMU graduates as well. And actually my grandfather attended SMU for a period of time, way back when. So we come from old Dallas families on both sides of my family, and so it is very much a homecoming in many respects. This is also the place where my interest, kind of the late part of my junior year into my senior year in international affairs and in Asia studies took root here, and so it's great to come back and to see the campus and to see, frankly, how international affairs has been embraced, and it's really become a big part of the university through this center as well as through the courses that are offered and the faculty resources that are available. So it's really changed a lot, and it's really great to see. As mentioned, I'm a former acting assistant USTR for Japan, Korea, APEC. That's just a long way of saying I was responsible for Japan, Korea, and APEC trade relations and trade negotiations. And I did focus on Japan prior to that. And as mentioned as well, I worked for about 11 years doing this at the Office of the U.S. Trade Representative, which many of you may or may not be familiar with, but it's a pretty small agency, about 220 employees, which is small by Washington standards. Very focused agency, very tight group. I think in many ways it's the kind of place that you hope if you were a government official you might have a chance to work. It's just a very committed institution with a clear mission and a clear objective, and it's just a wonderful place to be, and it's a real honor to have had that experience in the federal government. Of course, USTR is also known to the Dallas community perhaps a little bit by being Ron Kirk's home for a period of time. Of course, we spoke of him as Ambassador Kirk when he was in our building. A lot of fond memories that come from this. It's, opening his senior staff meetings, which were always Monday or Tuesday mornings, always open with a Dallas Cowboys update, if you will. Even if the Cowboys weren't playing that week or if it was the middle of May. He would also walk through, we're such a small agency and so tight-knit and such a flat organization. He would walk the halls from time to time to be friendly. I think a very gregarious individual, and so that was great. Although I remember one time he was walking the halls to say hi and dropping by people's offices, and he was kind of swinging around a golf club, which was slightly menacing, I have to say. I was just pleased it wasn't Ranger season. There was no baseball bat involved in that process. But I have been out of government for the past year, but I was directly involved in TPP, as mentioned before I left government. And I learned through my own dissertation research that former government officials are the absolute best people to talk to because they will tell you things that you won't get otherwise, and I think that's true. And so therefore my disclaimer, which is I'm here on my personal, obviously I'm not speaking for the U.S. government, I'm not a part of the U.S. government, I am affiliated with a couple of organizations. I'm here on my personal, representing myself and my own views. I'm not here representing any of the organizations I'm affiliated with right now. So the TPP, I think many of you are at least vaguely familiar or extremely familiar with what it is, but just to make sure, I just wanted to very briefly touch on exactly what it is so everyone's on the same page as we go forward. TPP, of course, is a trade negotiation among currently 12 member countries. It's the United States, but also Japan, Mexico, Canada, Australia, Singapore, New Zealand, Brunei, Chile, Peru, Malaysia, and Vietnam. And you couldn't probably think of a more diverse group of countries if you tried. You go from Brunei to the United States. You go from New Zealand, small population, very pastoral, to Japan, for example. And so it's a real interesting mix of countries. And I'll get to kind of how this came to be. because it's important with respect to why it does have a strategic, why the beyond economics implications are important. And the TPP is not yet done. These negotiations are very complex, very difficult, but a lot of progress has been made. In fact, so much progress, there was a expectation that they might be wrapped up this past July. Didn't happen. That's not unusual for trade negotiations. There's a lot of deadlines that are met or missed, but they're very, very close. And I think the full expectation is certainly in the very near future this will get done. And so this is kind of the basic bit of it. Of course, it's gotten more prominence in the United States in recent months. It's very well known in many other countries. In Japan, it's on the front page many days of the week, it seems like. Here, not so much, but it did get a lot of attention this past summer when there was a related piece of legislation called Trade Promotion Authority was brought before the Congress. And that invited a lot of critics to have their say. It invited presidential candidates to begin to take a side on the issue. I think Bernie Sanders became very animated and very opposed for very strong reasons. Hillary Clinton seems to kind of avoid talking about it, to be honest with you. There are Republicans who say they support it. There are Republicans who say they don't support it. There are Republicans you can't really tell. But it was even so intense that the president was basically in a war of words with Elizabeth Warren over her criticisms of this agreement as well. So the divisions both within the Republican Party, within the Democratic Party are very deep on this issue. It is a bipartisan issue to the extent that those who agree with it on both sides agree. It's maybe one of the few bipartisan issues left in Washington, which is, but that's becoming a bigger and bigger challenge. However, since I'm out of government, there's always seems to be protests when it comes to TPP speeches these days because of the controversy. So if there are any people with anti-TPP slogans or banners or rubber chickens or whatever it is you brought, you can put them away. I can't help you anymore. I'm not involved in it. But this controversy is very deep, not only in the United States, but in these other countries involved in the TPP. Malaysia, for example, is having big issues, domestic issues, over whether or not the TPP is seen in their strategic interest. Chile, there are critics in Chile, there are critics in Australia, and everywhere. So it is quite the thing, if you will. At this point, though, my job is to focus on the strategic importance of TPP. So blissfully, I get to jump over some of these economic controversies, although I'm happy to talk about them, to focus on the bigger picture. And that is, but before I do that, I think it's important to say that at the end of the day, without a doubt, and this is from my personal experience in government, as well as just knowing the situation, the politics, and the rest, the economic interest of the TPP is going to be the most important thing that is going to make this possible. So when I speak about beyond economics, it doesn't mean economics doesn't exist. In fact, that will be the driving force. If the economics are not there, if the open markets are not available, if the exporters that are interested in taking advantage of this agreement are not excited enough about what was agreed to, it may not happen. So I want to emphasize that. But I'm not going to focus on that. I want to focus on the broader context. And in fact, it's the strategic context of TPP that really has been kind of lost in this discussion and in the debate going forward in the United States. The Obama administration, I think, this is after I left, but I think reduced the argument on the strategic benefit of TPP down to the following phrase, essentially, in recent months. It goes basically like this. Without TPP, China, and not the United States, will be setting the rules for trade and investment in the Asia Pacific. That is, kind of makes people pause. That's probably the talking point that polls the best. I'm sure maybe some focus groups have been involved in this, who knows. But certainly it makes people think that this is something much bigger than a trade agreement. This is about the future of the architecture of the Asia-Pacific region when it comes to trade and investment. So the strategic importance is profound, and I think the way that was phrased sums it up. That's not the only reason it's profound, so I'll try and cover some of those issues as well. But I think you can always look at the benefits of something by looking at what happens if it doesn't happen. And I think that's probably the most important way, actually, of looking at the picture in TPP. What doesn't happen, or what a failure might mean in terms of U.S. strategic interests beyond economics, if you will, beyond the jobs and the other important aspects of the agreement. First, I'll just say, I think, without a doubt, U.S. leadership and credibility across this very large and important region will be seriously harmed. It really will, and it will be a big setback for the strategic, quote-unquote, pivot to Asia that the Obama administration has been seeking to focus on. It absolutely will lead the U.S. to fall behind in the Asia-Pacific region. Others will not wait for the United States to catch up with them. This is going on without us. It's kind of the international political economy version of you snooze, you lose. How does that happen? Well, the United States will de facto surrender economic leadership in the region. Others will fill that gap. It is China, but it's not just China. They have their own initiatives, and they will fill that gap. The United States is shut out of agreements among some of our largest foreign customers. That's borders on economic, but basically markets that were available to us will no longer be available to us because they were more available to other countries that have struck agreements with those markets. East and Southeast Asia in particular, I think it's safe to say, economically would become even more dependent on China and on China's growth and on China's behavior in the region, both in terms of trade, but that can bleed into other areas. That, I think, gets to what Professor Takuji was trying to focus on. And at the end of the day, I think it's fair to say that with the United States not involved in this process, somehow withdrawing or failing to pass or whatever it is, our ability to project our interests and our values, things like open and free markets, anti-corruption, fair competition, environmental protection, new issues that have come to the minds of many people focused on the effects of globalization, will be greatly diminished as well. So in this way, I think that it's safe to say the TPP by itself, it's a very consequential agreement. It's a very important group of countries. It's a very large potential effects. Even so, I think you can argue perhaps that it's not too big to fail necessarily. However, I think you can argue that it is too important to fail. Failing means the status quo. It means nothing happens, that the current situation continues, but the world will move forward and we will not have been part of that process. However, it's fair to say also that in today's very volatile political climate, that certainly doesn't guarantee that it won't fail. I think that's fair to say too. So how did we get here? I don't want to go, and why is this, why am I arguing this essentially? I don't think these are particularly surprising arguments, but I want to make the strong case for why I'm saying what I'm saying. And we have to kind of take a step back and look at where the world is come from in terms of trade and trade architecture and where it's going. Of course, there's kind of an arc of global trade liberalization since the end of World War II. I think many are familiar with the story. Progressive trade liberalization happened through multilateral global trade negotiations outside of the Soviet bloc, of course. This was successful. Global trade soared. Growth occurred. Advanced countries tended to liberalize more than others. They took on more of the responsibility. Very much a U.S. world order kind of situation. Global trade negotiations became a lot harder from the 1990s, I'd say, in the 80s, but into the 90s, primarily because there were many other countries that had developed, and their impact on markets and on trade was becoming very intense. First it was Japan back in the 70s, and then others like Korea, China, and India come along. And that not only impacts markets, it impacts the willingness of large economies to further open their markets unless those countries also reciprocate in some fashion. So that became a big focus. However, many of these countries were not that enthusiastic to open their markets to the United States and to the EU and to others. And so these kind of tensions begin to build. At the same time, you see, as these tensions are building, you see countries begin the early process of forming these regional trade groups. The EU is the earliest example, of course, which goes way back. Actually, there are, of course, historical examples back into the 19th century, but speaking post-World War II, the Southeast Asian nations get together and form the ASEAN and trying to promote liberalized trade within there. NAFTA happens, so the U.S. gets involved in this game. So this is beginning. At the same time, global trade liberalization is looking harder and harder. These successive rounds of multilateral negotiations get harder, and the Doha round, if you've heard that name before, was the most recent attempt to do that. However, Doha begins to fail because, again, the countries like the Brazils and the Indias, the Chinas, are not prepared to open their markets, and the U.S. basically walks away. I mean, the U.S. is trying to find ways to take advantage of these agreements. The other countries can take advantage. We want to take advantage of access to their markets. Frankly, the trade benefits for the United States are not enough to do that. And the United States these negotiations begin to stall and to kind of slow down and eventually stall, if you will. So what happens then? You have a rapid proliferation of regional and bilateral trade agreements to fill this gap. Now, the U.S. actually, this is around 2002, 2003, particularly into 2004, 2005. The United States began negotiations with a number of countries, Central American countries, Latin American countries, Middle Eastern countries, and a couple of countries in the Asia-Pacific region, or the Asian and Oceania region. We have about 20 of these agreements now, or agreements, I should say, with 20 different economies. And frankly, this was part of the U.S. strategy. When the Doha began to fail, part of the strategy was to do what is called, quote-unquote, competitive liberalization. That's a very complicated kind of concept, but the concept is simply, if you begin to open your markets to countries that are willing to do that, that will put pressure on those that aren't involved in that process to then come to the table and get serious about opening their markets in global trade negotiations. This is actually it was a big focus of the Bush administration when I was there. And so you see the United States getting involved in this game. And then everyone's like, what's going on? And China begins to get in this game. And they start doing agreements. Japan is like, wait a minute. And they start doing agreements. And you get this unbelievably rapid rise in the number of agreements that are taking place. And the global trade negotiations that have kind of moved the world forward since World War II are just there. Nothing's happening. So I've tried to be fairly straightforward, but I feel confident that I have a slide that will dramatically simplify things. I love this slide because it's from the Japanese trade ministry, but it shows you how complex it is, basically. And this is around 2006 is when this was created. I feel very confident that this particular ministry in Japan has a bunch of people in the basement that just churn these things out because we get all kinds of charts and graphs from this agency. However, it is actually slightly instructive in that it shows a couple of important things. It shows the blue rings, you see the regional groupings. I talked about kind of the early manifestation of regional trade liberalization through these agreements. But then from around 2002, 2003, 2004, it's going all different ways. It's going across the ocean, it's breaking outside of the regions, and it's going everywhere, basically. So it gets really complicated. Let's try, and here you can see actually the statistics on the number of trade agreements. This shows the number of these either bilateral, country to country, or regional, within several countries, trade agreements, and both in the Asia Pacific, which is on your right side, and then globally, which is on the left side. And you see around 2004 or so, it really begins to spike and just exponentially begin to jump. And so this is what is called, kind of the spaghetti bowl, which then in the Asia Pacific became known as the noodle bowl of trade agreements. How does this make sense to anyone anymore, basically? So this progressed, as I say, so it gets more graphic and complicated. You get these kinds of charts to explain the global trading system. You move to this kind of situation. And I can't even explain it. I have a final slide, which I think will simplify things. Here's Jackson Pollock's take on the global trade system, which is, I think, simpler than this slide, actually, if you look at it carefully. So anyway, my point is it gets very complicated. And so the question is, how can countries make sense of this? So first of all, I'm going to talk about the implications, and I'll talk about what happens. What happens when you do this? As I kind of alluded to earlier, if you have this proliferation of regional and bilateral trade deals, you get the issue of preferential access. Some are in and some are out. Some are getting the benefits of liberalizing trade with your partner. Others are cut out. That leads to kind of the economist's worst nightmare, which is called trade diversion, which means countries are not making what makes sense for them to make. It's making things that they have access to other markets to make. So it may make much more sense for the neighboring country to be making this and shipping it, but they're not doing it because a country has a preferential agreement with another country and they have a 0 tariff instead of a 25% tariff. So now they're doing things which they shouldn't be doing from an economic point of view, a pure economic point of view. It stokes regional rivalries. It does. It begins to proliferate, kind of like who's your friend? Who's in? Who's out? It undermines the global trade liberalization movement, which most people would see as probably the most beneficial path to global growth and helping developing countries to develop, et cetera. On the flip side, I mentioned some of the rationale for why these things happen. On the flip side, some of the positives that these negotiations are easier to finish. We only have 2 countries. It's a much different process than sitting down with 150 countries in the WTO and trying to strike a deal. It's also easier through this process to pursue more comprehensive and more detailed and more specific trade agreements with specific countries on specific issues. So there's WTO principles, there's principles of intellectual property protection and services, liberalization, et cetera, that are on the books for everyone to follow. But if you're having a market access problem in a certain country, then you can use a trade agreement to deal with that specific issue, if that's your priority, for example. So these agreements become more complex. They become longer. They go from a couple hundred pages to like 800 pages. They become more rigorous, and they become a lot more difficult to maneuver if you're a business potentially. You don't know what obligation is for what or which tariff is lowering for which country, when. There's just a lot of complexities that come into it. So it's very advantageous from a negotiator's point of view, but it's also creates some complications. And certainly the United States very aggressively began to customize its trade agreements with these countries more and more and more. And each agreement was kind of, the expectation was that the next agreement would be better. And the next agreement would be better in terms of the protections, the market access commitments. And in fact, these agreements really kind of morph from being trade agreements, quote unquote, they are still trade agreements, to being something more like a market access agreement, meaning it's not only about what happens at the border to your product, it's what happens behind the border to your product. And are you protected, and are you able to sell your product without discrimination, et cetera? So these concerns get broader and broader. New issues come into play, like in the Bush administration, there was a push for starting to add labor and environment standards to agreements. That became even stronger in the Obama administration, for example. So they take on a kind of a life of their own, and they grow exponentially, if you will. At the same time, many of the agreements I showed you previously, it seems like some of the countries kind of take a path of less resistance in concluding in their agreements. Meaning, the U.S. has been looking for a very strong, very high standard, more rules, more access, 0 tariffs or virtually 0 tariffs for all products. And a lot of these agreements you see here aren't really moving that ball forward in terms of global trade liberalization overall, and in removing protection in countries. Countries are avoiding using these agreements to really make the hard decisions to open their markets and to find new sources of growth. I'll give you a great example, and I'm not picking on any country in particular, it's just the one I'm most familiar with is Japan. Japan started to negotiate a large number of trade agreements in the region with individual countries, etc. But in virtually every agreement, Japan liberalized less in terms of goods trade, in terms of the actual tariff lines that they would either reduce or take to zero. They kept it at around 600 that were completely off limits, for example, mainly agriculture products. It got to the point where in Japan's negotiations with Switzerland, Japan refused, and at the end of the agreement is that Swiss pineapples and Swiss bluefin tuna are not tariff-free. The logic is that if you make it tariff-free with Switzerland, where in theory it doesn't matter, then Malaysia will want that too. So these agreements kind of have a moment, and so there's a logic to it, but it's kind of crazy. The concern is that there's a kind of a race to a lower common denominator standard, the easiest standard. Everyone's competing with each other to have these agreements, but they're not focused on the quality of what they're doing, and are they really helping to advance trade liberalization across the globe? So this is where the TPP picks up. So that was a long story to get to this point. And this is where the discussion of the TPP really comes into play. And it really began it began with 4 much smaller countries before the United States ever got involved, and they had formed their own small regional group, and I'll come to that in a second. But the issues that were being raised around 2005, 2006 were, how do you make sense of this? Could you take a trade agreement and another trade agreement and dock them together somehow and create a bigger trade agreement? How are you going to advance trade liberalization and make this more simple for business to use, make it more meaningful in terms of the economic impact, make it more useful? Also, within Asia in particular, the western side of the Pacific Ocean, there was a lot of talk of an Asian trade bloc. Japan was very eager to not lose in this game, and was talking very strongly about an ASEAN, which is the Southeast Asian countries, +6 arrangement. So it's those ASEAN countries plus Japan, Korea, China, India, Australia, New Zealand. China was advocating an ASEAN +3 approach, which is just the ASEAN countries plus Japan, Korea, China. Japan liked the other, bigger approach because it meant less likely that any one country would dominate, which meaning China in the process. And so this is going on. And the Asian countries are looking among themselves to come together and to liberalize trade. At the same time, the global trade negotiations are basically dead, or at least on very serious life support. And the U.S. is looking to, with all this going on, looking to potentially, even with its own trade deals that it's been doing, is looking at facing getting cut out of Asia in terms of market access and in terms of helping to be an active participant in mutually beneficial economic growth through these agreements. And so that's kind of the situation. So here's kind of where things have parked themselves. Actually, if I go back to this slide, you'll see where it increases exponentially and then begins to kind of level off a little bit, at least on the right side in the Asia-Pacific region. And that's because the countries came around to kind of 2 bigger concepts that are being pursued right now. The TPP is one of them among 12 countries in the Asia-Pacific region. The other is called RCEP, which is this ASEAN +6 concept that I just mentioned, basically. And so, so what that means is this. This is the list of countries that are currently configured in both of the agreements, and you get kind of a growth in kind of 2 blocks potentially that would develop in terms of trade. So the countries in one circle would liberalize to each other. The countries in the other circle would liberalize to each other. Some would get both, if you will, if both negotiations are successful. And so this is kind of the current situation. And so with that, that's why the line leveled off, and there was more focus on a kind of two blocks. There was a difference in these two blocks, and it's important. When the U.S. was advocating TPP as an option for the Asia-Pacific, it wanted to maintain high standard rules. It wanted to continue to build on the architecture that the U.S. agreements had built, much more advanced, much more comprehensive in terms of liberalization. And it argued, it sought kind of a coalition of the willing, and that's a loaded term, I know, but it's really countries that are ready for this kind of, this level of trade liberalization in the region, among APEC countries, so among countries that are members of the APEC group. It was also seen as a pathway, potential pathway to a broader agreement across the Asia-Pacific region, among all countries, or most countries in the Asia-Pacific region, the FTAAP, as some people call it. And to get there, the U.S. advocated for an open architecture, meaning, compared to the RCEP concept, in those countries, that is a closed, only those countries are members. The TPP was made an open platform, meaning countries, if they wanted to aspire to join, had the opportunity to do that and to participate in this agreement. So as the agreement was negotiated, some countries actually came into the negotiations as they were going along, and the concept is that after the agreement is done, new countries could then come into this agreement as well. So it's a way of expanding the growth of an Asia-Pacific-wide trade bloc, if you will. And finally, the idea that the concept that this would not be a static initiative. This would enable new issues to be dealt with. In other words, as you bring in new countries, you can negotiate new issues. It wants to be a living agreement, basically, essentially, that's up to date and is writing the rules and kind of leading the way in terms of opening markets through the region. So in this process, there's a lot of focus on China and a lot of feeling that China is kind of driving this whole architecture and concern about China and being cut out, China being, it's exerting its influence in the region. Yes, I mean, China is an issue, of course, but I think it's fair to say at that point in time when the TPP was really developed, it was really a U.S. strategic response to the situation going on in the region, at least as much as it was a response to making sure that the U.S. influence was there and helping to counterbalance China's influence. So I think there is absolutely an aspect to that, but I think it's not just China. It's really kind of what's going on and how the U.S. is going to respond and exert some leadership in this region by making it open, by making it inclusive instead of exclusive, et cetera. So this is kind of the overall history. I have some other slides which focus on the history, which I don't think I really need to go into. But let me kind of focus on what has happened since the negotiations have taken place. First, this is just basically the economic importance of the groups. This is the original countries that negotiated a small version of TPP and their economic importance and how it rises as other countries join the negotiations, so that now it's about 40% of global GDP in terms of the countries represented, and they're responsible for about a third of world trade. So it's we're not talking bananas here. We're talking something very, very big and consequential. So I have the statistic there. What has happened since that time is other countries have started to show interest in the TPP. Some have joined as the process has gone on. Some have said, well, we're really interested. Maybe we're not ready yet, or maybe actually in the case of Korea, I think they probably now would say, we'd like to get in, but it's unfortunately at the very last second of the negotiations, it's hard to see that happening. But as a next candidate, in the Philippines and Thailand and Taiwan, very interested, Indonesia, potentially interested, China, but a question mark because I don't think we know exactly what its intentions are at this point. But here is an initiative that the U.S. worked on with a number of smaller countries in the Asia-Pacific, which has grown exponentially over time, and which is showing greater interest among many other countries in the region to come into the agreement at a later point in time. So with that in mind, I think it's safe to say that the concept of TPP has been very successful. And that's why I say at this point, how can you see the United States walking away from something that it helped to drive and create and all these countries are depending on, and then walking away from essentially its own economic interests in terms of growth and expanded trade that would come from this kind of agreement, but also in terms of these relationships. So it is a very high-stakes situation. That's why I was trying to argue that it's too important to fail at this point. At the end of the day, whether or not it fails, I think, again, is going to come down to economic interest and whether or not, through the democratic process, the Congress deems that this is in the United States' economic interest. But I think it would have great implications if it were not to take place, particularly now that the concept has really become very important and successful as a new vehicle for Asian-Pacific trade architecture. Interestingly, the concept of TPP has really kind of been replicated now in other trade negotiations. So the WTO, the global process I talked about earlier that was stalled and not moving, well, it is starting to move a little bit now. It's starting to move with very specific agreements in specific areas among a group of countries who are members of the WTO. So it's the multilateral system where you get all 150 countries are supposed to agree, becomes kind of a coalition of the willing when it comes to liberalizing trade in environmental goods and services. That's a negotiation currently going on among a certain number of countries. Among information technology products, for example, and services agreements negotiations. So the model of those countries that are ready to stand up and be counted and liberalize their markets are welcome to join and to participate with each other. And so it's, so I think if the U.S., if there was a failure somehow for the U.S. to become a party to TPP or TPP failed in some fashion, this would potentially cascade into these other agreements. The U.S. is part of those other agreements, and so are we going to be hiving ourselves off from those agreements as well. There is potentially, I don't know that it's horribly convincing, but I think there's a real potential that could kind of cascade, if you will. So there's some big questions that go forward, because this is really a story with a beginning, a middle, but no end yet. I think the end questions are questions like, will the TPP expand to really become the Asia-Pacific free trade platform, if you will? I think the answer is a highly likely yes. It will take time, but I think eventually it's easier when countries are to bring countries up than it is to bring countries that are here down, if you will, in terms of their ambition. Will TPP expand beyond the APEC region? Currently it's limited to APEC countries, which are most of the countries in the Asia-Pacific Rim, if you will. I don't know the answer to that question, but it could. If we were having a discussion earlier today, if India wanted to come into this, would the TPP members be open to that? At the moment, no, because they're not a member of APEC, but in the future, I don't know. So it could become even bigger. These are the kinds of questions which I think the momentum is there that the TPP has created. The question is, will these kinds of things occur? So I think it's safe to say the strategic part of this argument is pretty clear cut. Yes, it affects military posture and military relations because you build greater, deeper, stronger relationships with countries, without a doubt. Yes, it affects diplomatic relations with countries where we have common interests. We're on common ground when it comes to protection of certain products or how rules are dealt with. And so we kind of take a common approach vis-a-vis other countries or other problems, if you will, that these agreements help foster. So all those are in there. But and certainly for the United States, I think the strategic case is extremely clear. Countries in the Asia-Pacific are really looking to U.S. leadership to help drive this forward. And us withdrawing from it means they will do whatever they have to do to protect their own economic interests. However, TPP could fail, as I mentioned, because the economics just aren't there. I don't think that's the case. I think the economics will be there, but the agreement will have to sell itself. But certainly I think it's important that if it does fail, the U.S. not abdicate its leadership on this initiative as the reason for it to fail. The U.S. withdrawing from the ability to be a part of this agreement if Congress rejects the agreement or if it becomes too difficult or if et cetera, would be pretty calamitous, I think, in terms of perceptions of the United States, both in the Asia-Pacific region, but also globally, as really committed to free and open and liberalized trade and to expanding these relationships with these countries. So let me leave it there, and I'll be happy to entertain any questions you may have.
Okay, I will invite Dr. Beeman to the
Sure.
seat, and we are moving to a discussion now. I'd like to.
My goodness. Thank you.
I'd like to raise the first question, although I have so many questions, but let me make it keep it one. This is a very simple, but maybe hard to answer. What is your perspective of what will happen for TPP negotiation?
Great question. That's what everyone wants to know, and it's certainly a crystal ball question that everyone wishes they had the answer to. By all appearances, I think when you're in these negotiations, when you see things and read things, you really understand what they mean. And I think by all appearances, I think there's every reason to be optimistic that this agreement will happen and will happen in the short term. As I say, they seem to be very close. In July, actually they were in Maui for that meeting, the ministers, and as far as I understand, at least last I saw in the news, there's no date scheduled yet necessarily for a next round, but I think the expectation is when that date is scheduled, it means that the countries will have a very good idea that that will be the final round. They're not going to bring their ministers together to have another failure.
Okay, thanks. Let's open to the question. Yes, Dan.
Thank you so much for your remarks. It's really interesting. So when you were talking about trade agreements and trade blocs, typically, traditionally, they have been very regional in nature, as is the TPP. And it struck me when you said, could India join? Maybe, but not now. I'm really curious how important it is to keep trade agreements regional or have regional blocks given technology and the movement of goods and services and all of that.
Mm-hmm. I think your point is, well, I mean, there's two ways of looking at it. Number one is it is regional in terms of Asia Pacific, but you can argue that the distances between the countries and certainly those negotiators involved in the process when they're flying to all these different places for the rounds will attest with their frequent flyer mile accounts. They're very, very expansive indeed, but there is a logic to the Asia-Pacific region, and I understand what you're saying. I think that concept of moving beyond kind of natural feeling blocks or whatever is absolutely going to be a new topic. And so one of the intriguing, the United States has also, since pursuing TPP, has started a big free trade negotiation with the EU, for example. So do you see a TPP-EU hookup? I think it would have to be countries that are really hitting a high level of liberalization and are able to kind of take on not only the bigness of this, but the concept and the commitment to it. And so wherever in the globe they are, but that's what I mean by the TPP evolving and potentially reaching outside the area. I think that will be an interesting question. I think it's premature at this point because just trying to get done what they're doing now is very difficult. But yeah, in 10 years' time, I think that could very well be the big topic, for example.
Thomas.
Thank you very much for this presentation. I wanted to ask you two questions. The first one is about China. I wanted to ask you if you could tell us a little more about China's perspective, how it has evolved over the years, and to what extent it sees this TPP as a US attempt to somewhat prevent its rise to global leadership. And my second question, which I think you partly answered just a few seconds ago, is about the potential articulation between the Trans-Pacific Partnership and the Transatlantic Partnership. Because in France, so I come from France, and we have many debates about the nature of the Transatlantic Partnership. and we see it as a way for the United States to reassert its leadership. So I wanted to know if the Obama administration sees the TPP and the transatlantic partnership as two equal creatures, so to speak, or but the TPP was really special. Thank you.
Okay, great. In terms of your last question, no, I don't think. I mean, I think again, I can't speak for the administration anymore. I'm not going to pretend to do that. But certainly, my impression is that both are very equally important. I think the reason the TPP gets more attention is because it's much closer to being finished, and frankly, it's in some ways more difficult. And it's been going on longer. But I think there is a strong commitment to move forward with both. Certainly, the resources are being put into both to move them forward as efficiently as possible. But these things do take time. So that's the simple answer to that question. In terms of China, I think it just actually Hiroki and I were talking about this earlier. I think it kind of depends on the moment in time as to how China has reacted to this whole initiative. And kind of in the beginning, when the United States joined with these 4 other countries, and then other countries started coming in and began to kind of take form and shape. China, I think there was some report where some Chinese officials said, "Well, we have not been invited." So they were looking at it as a closed system, if you will. Well, the response, and the true response, was, "Well, it's not something you're invited to." This was the retort, if you will. It's not something you're invited to, it's something you aspire to, meaning countries that are ready to take on this kind of level of liberalization and high standard rules, investment rules, and other things would be, this is for those countries. And so if you're ready, let's talk. To date, China has not been talking, as far as I understand. From time, I think they're very interested, and certainly the closer and closer TPP gets, the more interested they get in its progress. They have their own negotiation going on now, which is making much slower progress, but still could well come together in the next year, maybe 2. And so it will be interesting to see when this agreement's done, when the agreement is released. Will China say, it's time for us, we'd like to join, we think we can do this? What will the U.S. response be at that point? Politically, difficult. Economically, could be huge, potential to open China's market further, but it will be very controversial, and it will have to be a very strong case, for example. So the other countries, certainly in the region, would be very interested in China joining TPP, more so with less political baggage, if you will, than the United States might have in this kind of discussion. So it's kind of hot and cold, and I think, as Hiroki was also saying earlier as well, there's a lot of domestic dynamics within China where it may explain some of this hot and cold, with the reformists and the non-reformists are kind of battling it out with each other and seeing whether TPP will help push China further forward, or would people want to stay out of TPP and hold it back, essentially.
Yeah, so I'll pick up the last point you mentioned. So China is roughly saying that it's divided into reformists and conservatives, and the reformists want to use the TPP for advancing the reforms and giving the pressure to move the reform forward. In the meantime, conservatives try to protect the vested interests, and TPP would undermine the vested interests, so they really had to try to stop the TPP. So that's actually, so if you take China as a kind of like a plural player, then like so that would explain the kind of different kind of voices that are coming out of China. Nate.
Thank you. Nice speech. 2 questions. What is the largest American focus as concerns non-tariff barriers? And then outside, or from the non-American perspective, what's been the biggest obstacle?
In terms of non-tariff barriers, everything. I think that's pretty much much of the attitude. You can't have everything, though, of course. There are some basic rules in the global trading system on things like, if a product is a country says a particular product is unsafe, they have to show that it's unsafe. They can't just say it is in order to discriminate and exclude your product. Same for food safety. They have to be able to show scientifically that there's a food safety concern or health concern. They can't just say there's a concern and then block your market as a protectionist measure, essentially. So those basic concepts are there. So the TPP is really, so to the extent those concepts exist, the focus of the TPP is to try and raise those standards even further. It doesn't deny, it doesn't change the equation when it comes to, are things safe, and is that, they're not trying to change that equation, but they're trying to find ways to deal with problems more efficiently, for example, so that trade is less disrupted if there is a real concern. So that kind of thing is developing. There's intellectual property, investment protections as well that there are global rules on. They're trying to raise the standard, et cetera. I think, as tariffs fall globally, the non-tariff barriers become, of course, the more important barriers. Some of those can be very controversial because they can get deeply into countries' traditions or regulatory approaches. It can get into perceptions. It can get into a lot of different things, and that's part of the reason the TPP negotiations have been hard. The United States has been successful in advocating for a lot of these rules bilaterally. So the question is, what can be achieved with these particular 12 countries? I mean, we have FTAs, free trade agreements, with some of the TPP partners already. So they're new ones that would have to agree to those kinds of rules and to kind of lift the boat. And in terms of what's most difficult from the external perspective, I think, frankly, it's the level of ambition that the U.S. has brought to this negotiation. I think in many areas, and certainly the Japanese, I think, since they joined the negotiations, are very much in the same boat on many issues, feel that there's just much more that can be done to, well, let me put it this way, we're essentially the demandeurs on many of the issues. And we have friends on certain issues, but trying to move other countries toward higher environmental standards, toward higher labor standards, toward higher intellectual property protection, toward these things that become important in terms of the balance of trade and the fairness of trade, if you will. I think that's probably been the biggest struggle for them, is adapting their systems. You take a country like Vietnam, and you think of what their political regulatory system is like, and now you try and bring that into the TPP context. That's a huge leap that Vietnam is potentially making. So that's, I think, probably the biggest, actually, challenge.
Forgive my ignorance, but does this agreement have to be approved by Congress or by the Senate?
Absolutely, yes.
The Senate or the whole Congress?
The whole Congress, yes.
Given Congress's refusal to reauthorize the Exim Bank, well, let me ask you, do you see that as an indicator of, while they say it's all about doing away with subsidies for big business, my sense is there's also some kind of anti-internationalist sentiment, behind Congresses, or maybe it's just certain key members, including 2 key members from our state. And then a comment, I'd like your reaction to this, because you saw the story in the Wall Street Journal today about how global trade, the growth of global trade has been declining for the last 2 years. So it seems to me this is a very important agreement, and I assume you would concur with that.
Yeah, absolutely. It's funny you mentioned the Exim Bank issue. I'm not horribly familiar with it, but obviously been following it in the broader context, and it kind of raises a similar parallel issue, which is other countries are doing it, and if the U.S. isn't doing it, are we going to be cut out of opportunities? And I think that's certainly the way the U.S. business community feels about the Exim. There's in that sense kind of a parallel to the TPP negotiations, which is other countries are going to do this without us, so we can do it, or we can be in it and try and shape it and advance it for our own interests, or we can sit on the sides and watch it happen.
Nicholas, hello, thank you for your very interesting talk. My question, I want to pick up a little bit on the last point you made about Vietnam, and when there were this moment towards a very big WTO negotiations for trade liberalizations, one of the arguments that was often made was that trade liberalization would have tremendous effects on the global poor, and it would lift people out of poverty. However, in the talk that you've given, the trajectory you've presented to us, there's a move to drop, but many of the poorer countries are sort of not part of these things that you call coalitions of the willing. But Vietnam stands as sort of an example of a country that could participate. So I wanted to ask you to comment a little bit and maybe speculate on what effects this might have, this sort of bifurcated system of some countries pursuing more trade liberalization, but also some other regions in Africa, Central America, not being part of these agreements.
Yeah, that's a great question. And it's not only Vietnam. Peru is also, for example, part of this agreement. And Malaysia is kind of a more mixed state, if you will, of economic development. Mexico, which is in a more mixed state, if you will. But yes, I mean, I think the point of TPP is that, yes, I think at the end of the day, the United States would prefer a successful global liberalization round. I think that would be, and I think the international consensus would be that, except for those that, but when you start to talk about what that would be, that's where all the disagreements break out, essentially. So, and will the TPP take account in some fashion of different levels of development? That's a possibility. I don't know the answer to that question. Will it be, there are ways you can do that in a trade agreement. You can give longer phase-in periods on tariffs, for example, or phase-out periods on tariffs. You can phase in rules or commitments and that kind of thing. And I truly don't know the answer to that, but I think it's certainly a possibility. And that's one way you can kind of help account for those differences. Certainly, I think, though, what it will do with countries like Vietnam and Peru and others like that in the mix, it will, as I say, a lot of the other countries that are kind of fighting and interested in the TPP, the Philippines and Indonesia, I mean, those aren't necessarily, very lesser developed, but they are very intrigued, and I think they understand that this is a great interest to them as well. So I think that will be made. Whether accommodations are made will remains to be seen. And then at the same time, just to be fair, I think the U.S. does have a lot of other programs outside of the TPP. For example, the SACU, U.S. South African countries arrangement, and AGOA, and other of these initiatives that are where, particularly the very poorest countries, the U.S. provides incredibly generous market access to these countries. So it's not that the U.S. isn't doing anything. It's just a question, but it is an excellent question as to, are you potentially cutting out the developing economies, and is that a bad thing? And I think the answer could be yes, but I think you'll see more and more come into it.
Actually, I'd like to pick up the Vietnam case, and that's a very interesting case. That so Vietnam, for some reason, in some way, Vietnamese reformists convinced the domestic politics for using TPP as an opportunity to advance domestic economic reform. And then I don't know how it happened in detail, but I hope like the same thing will happen in China. That's my hope. So I'm not saying that it will happen, so Vietnam is, I think, a very interesting case in that sense.
The United States has, the United States has two major trading partners, obviously Canada to the north and Mexico to the south. And there's been an increasing amount of interest and trade between China and Mexico, for example. Would you have any insight into the views that either Canada and or Mexico have in terms of the TPP?
Sure. In terms of the China, vis-a-vis China, or just in terms of their eagerness?
Yes.
Okay. Yeah, I mean, the Mexico and Canada both joined in 2012. So the negotiations had already been going on for 2 or 3 years at that point. And certainly, and actually, it was actually, I think, a positive development, because a lot of the criticism of trade has revolved around NAFTA and the effects of NAFTA, without a doubt. And actually, I remember in his one of his first debates, presidential debates, the president promised a renegotiation of NAFTA, if you will. So this is really what that is, and what it does is to take the NAFTA concept, which was done 25 years ago, or 25 years ago, and to update it and to strengthen the labor and environmental standards, et cetera. So this kind of is that that moment. So I think as the TPP began to progress, there were a number of countries that were interested. Japan, we were talking to Japan at the time, Mexico and Canada. Mexico and Canada were just ready before others. Japan was going through a lot of political difficulty at home and wasn't able to make it happen to move forward, but Canada and Mexico were, and they came in at the same time, the same negotiating round. So yeah, I think they both see this in their strategic interest. Canada has been trying to do negotiation with Japan for their own FTA, so this would kind of complete that circle for them. It opened up a lot of new avenues for them, and they wanted to be part of this Asia Pacific region. And actually, it kind of has manifested itself in terms of some of the negotiating issues. Some of the NAFTA concepts have become important in terms of what will be agreed, or at least perceptions of what should be carried into the TPP. One of the biggest issues right now, which is widely reported, that is hanging up the negotiations, is the idea of rules of origin, which is where a vehicle is made, or this particular an automobile or automobile parts. And there's a lot of people who want to carry the NAFTA rule into the TPP, and the question is whether or not that kind of agreement can be reached among the other parties. Japan is not pleased, for example.
Yes.
So there's the coming election for the president coming up, and I was just wondering your opinion on what will happen to the TPP, just if anything will happen.
Right. Will it? Yes. Can it progress in a presidential season? I guess is the big question. Sure. I mean, the current timing of things is such that even if the agreement were reached tomorrow and the signature took place, there's kind of a sequence of events that has to take place, and there has to be part of the sequence, and it's absolutely needs to happen. Is the agreement has to be made open and public, and there has to be a full debate, and it has to go through the congressional process, and there has to be a minimum number of days before it could even move forward into Congress. That's by the U.S. rules that were passed for trade agreements, for example. And so if you take the calendar and you move it forward, you are absolutely, even if it's done in the very near term, which it won't next week, you're already carrying it into the primary season, essentially. Now, it's definitely a complicating factor. I think it will be easier. I think we'll have to wait and see to be able to predict that question after the agreement is done, and the benefits are there, and those that have concerns about the weaknesses will have their voices heard. And I think people begin to take sides pretty quickly, irrespective of the presidential debate at that point. And I say that because, as I say, the Democratic Party is divided on this. The Republican Party is now divided on this. There tend to be more Republicans in favor and fewer Democrats in favor compared to the other on each side of the aisle. But overall, it will test a lot of politicians, particularly those who are new to trade and new to voting on trade, for example, and the constituent interests that they have. So that said, I think it will be very complicated, and it is doable, it is possible. My very personal prediction is that the most likely the best time would be the lame duck session at the end of next year to pass it.
What was the political economy of the passing of the TPA, Trade Promotion Authority?
It was...
who supposed, who opposed, and then what was the development of the discussion that led to finally passing TPA?
Right, and for those who don't know, the TPA is it's legislation, and it's congressionally mandated, so it was taken up this past spring and summer, and it does really, and what's misunderstood about TPA, it really does three things. It gives some very detailed guidance to the executive branch as to what the expectations are for trade agreements, what their expectations are. There's a lot of language in there about it should do this, it should not do this, it should do this, etc. It also provides transparency requirements on the administration as it proceeds with the process. There's a lot of transparency provisions in there. And then the kind of the part that people focus on is the what's called the fast track authority, which means when the agreement is done among the different countries, when it comes to Congress, they can vote up or down. They can't amend it. That's important for other countries because the idea of Congress getting involved in amending the agreement and then passing it based on their amendments and then having to go back and renegotiate with another country that's the death almost of international trade agreement essentially. So it's kind of a compact and a trust, if you will, going both ways. And so it's very controversial because it was tied up very closely with TPP. So basically people were voting on TPA as a mechanism to pass TPP eventually when it's done. But that mechanism, TPP got involved as kind of the target of a lot of opposition. A lot of pressure was put on Congress. So it passed with the most razor-thin margins, basically, which is ironic because the previous vote on any trade agreement that has been taking place in the Congress was for the U.S.-Korea Free Trade Agreement, which passed with one of the largest majorities of any trade bill in history. So with that in mind, where is the Congress on trade? I think it's a little hard to say because I think TPA is a little different than a concrete trade agreement, so you might get more votes. But the process kind of was messy, frankly. It was, it was like, what's the equivalent? It's like the 12-second left on the clock Tony Romo play. It's like, you got the team there, and the goal line is there, and it makes sense that you're going to get to the goal line. It's a little messy. You may drop the ball, but you're going to pick it up, and you're going to make it happen somehow. And that's kind of essentially what the politics of it was, to be honest with you. It was old-fashioned political horse trading among those who were going either way to vote counting and really bringing it home. So it was very difficult, and it was a big contrast with the previous trade vote, which happened 5 years prior to that. So we will see, but that's maybe not the best analogy, but I think we can all understand that one.
Kathy. Thank you very much. On what you just said, this was not my question, but on the TPA, I remember something very similar when President George Bush got that authority back in the early part of the decade. So, but my question is a small one, but one that interests me. Sorry, you mentioned the unusual set of countries that are part of the TPP. I have to say that the biggest surprise to me is not Vietnam, but Brunei. And they were one of the original four. I think of them as oil, and a little more oil. How were they involved in being one of the original four? I'd be curious what your thoughts are there. Thank you.
Wow, actually, since the United States was not involved in the original, it was called the P4 agreement, that was the genesis of TPP. It was Brunei, Chile, New Zealand, and Singapore. I wish I knew the answer to the question, but I don't. It happened back in around 2002, and but they were part of that original group and at the table and ready to go. I think, with countries like Singapore and Brunei, frankly, that P4 was kind of a coalition of the willing sort of initiative as well at the time. They were aiming for a high standard agreement, and they were, New Zealand is very aggressive on free trade, Singapore very aggressive, Chile much more aggressive certainly, and so Brunei, I think, they don't have anything to lose, basically. So it's an easy catch, if you will, perhaps. That's probably not the real answer, but that's certainly an accurate reflection of reality.
The Sultan wanted to be part of the club.
I would like to know some of the disadvantages of this agreement, and also what are the arguments against the TPP?
Sure. Yeah, absolutely. I mean, there is a broad range of criticism. of the TPP. It ranges from, well, it ranges from the strategic, although it's kind of hard to claim that it's a closed architecture and it's just, it's not. So there's that kind of issue. But mostly it revolves around the economics, obviously, of trade agreements and people's views about what the advantages of open and free trade can be and is versus the impacts that it has, on individual people and companies. When I was at USTR, I spoke to 250 auto workers. I was the face of Japan and TPP, and they are very not happy with that concept. But it was very interesting because I wasn't going to convince people, but I wanted them to understand certainly the various ways in which their concerns, their very specific concerns, we were trying to address as much as possible. Because certainly those are folks who are worried about their jobs and they're worried about their plant closing. It's not necessarily that Japan would do that to them. Frankly, if they're a Ford worker, Chrysler could do that to them. So it's not exclusive to trade agreements, but generally speaking, most of the biggest, most vocal criticisms of TPP have focused on those, and I think it was mentioned earlier, those who have generally a perception of kind of anti-globalization, anti-corporatization, these kinds of broad brush. And it doesn't mean there are some legitimate concerns about national sovereignty and those kinds of things. I really believe that trade agreements deal effectively with those concerns. I don't believe that countries really sell out their national sovereignty in these agreements. They make commitments to keep their markets open, essentially, but they have plenty of latitude to close them if there's a very, very good reason for health, safety, or other kinds of reasons. So, so it is, there are critics and there are concerns, and every attempt is made in these trade negotiations to deal with those things. For example, one of the agreements we reached with Japan, and this is public, so I can say it, it's not the secret agreement, was that because the United States knew these concerns about Japanese auto imports was very strong in the manufacturing community and as well as labor unions and others, Japan agreed to the longest phase-out period of any product in the TPP agreement. Which what does that mean? The U.S. has a 2.5% tariff on autos, so it's pretty low already, although the auto companies would argue that the volume of trade, that's a large number, ultimately. There's a 25% tariff on trucks, which are basically SUVs, light trucks, I should say, SUVs. And so the longest staging period of any product in the TPP means typically trade agreements, the longest staging period is about 20 to 25 years. That's for sensitive products, so before a country will actually reduce their tariffs to zero, it will take that long for adjustments to occur and for companies to get ready for that kind of situation. So, so there are a lot of accommodations made in Japan for their own agricultural sector, and in Malaysia for their own interests, and it goes on and on and on. So those are the hard parts of trade negotiations. But there is a lot of attempt made to lessen the immediate impacts while trying to advance the overall greater good and goal of economic growth. So that's the concept.
As we mentioned earlier, there are concerns about Americans losing jobs as a result of this agreement. So what could pro-trade Democrats tell their pro-Bernie Sanders friends about the TPP to reassure them? And my second question is, I didn't know that America was not a part of the original four. So how did America become a part of this deal?
Great. What can people say? Well, I think part of the difficulty in this process is that there's no agreement yet. I think when the agreement is reached and people can see the actual outcome, and there's a lot of conspiracy about what it might be and what it could be and whether it's going to destroy, American communities, or all of these, very strong statements are made out there. I think people will be able to look at it and make those judgments for themselves. So I think it can be argued that the benefits, the economic, strategic, and other benefits that are general, but I think until people actually see what it's going to do for individual communities, for companies in those communities, for exporters, for holders of intellectual property, those kinds of things, I think the case will be easier to make at that point, I hope. I'm sorry, I forgot the second question.
The second question was, how did America become a part of this?
Oh, right. Right, so we were not original. It's just actually a Bush administration initiative, and as I mentioned, it was a response to this proliferation of agreements, and so, I wasn't there for that particular discussion or the series of discussions personally, but I think the Bush administration was looking for a way to advance this cause, and frankly, just started talking to the P4 countries. They had just finished, or were just finishing their own trade agreement. They had not. There were a couple other side agreements that they were going to then begin to negotiate. One on financial services, I think the other on investment, I believe. So there's kind of chapters of agreements. And at that point, the U.S. said we want to participate and we want to join those negotiations. And then the Bush administration was getting ready to begin to move forward. The Bush administration was replaced by the Obama administration, and everything had to undergo review again. But then, when the review was done at the end of 2009, I believe it was, the president said he wants to move forward with the Trans-Pacific Partnership with those countries, and then other countries started becoming involved. So that's kind of the mechanical history of what happened.
Yes, I have a question about the security strategy side of the Trans-Pacific Partnership. So when I talk to Chinese security strategists who truly do tend to be conservatives, but they see two things that are primary in their mind, both of which the USTR has a hand in. The first is the Trans-Pacific Partnership, which they think is just an attempt to throttle their growth in the cradle, so to speak, and prevent the rise of China economically. But the second one is something that's become a big issue over the last few weeks, which is cybersecurity, where the administration and pretty much everybody in the United States is constantly accusing China of hacking almost everything. And over the last few weeks, we've seen the president say that they're going to come out and they're going to pursue economic redress, which presumably the USTR is going to have a hand in this. So my question is, how is the USTR going to try and do this two-step? Because they're also trying to reassure China as they negotiate with China. And what kind of outcomes, as far as these strategies, do you see playing out?
Sure. Well, in terms of the accusation that the U.S. is being exclusive to China, well, the TPP is potentially open to China's participation. And I think the other easy retort is, well, China's got its own regional bloc initiative going on, so it's a little presumptuous, I think, to say or to accuse the United States of being, exclusionary when it comes to its position vis-a-vis other countries in the region, I think. And so I think in terms of an argument, the U.S. has an easy upper hand to kind of make that argument. Well, if you're really ready, then we can talk about that. The second, the cybersecurity, is much more complicated, and I never thought that through, but you're right, it's possible that USTR could be involved in, well, I mean, I'm not in the government, but could well be involved in the process of determining, what, if anything, economically could be done vis-a-vis China. So, in that regard. So, I don't have, I've seen one similar process involving another country, or kind of aware of it, and all what you would expect is typically all possibilities are on the table, and there are a lot of bad ones, basically, and so you come up with a list that kind of meets an appropriate response to get the attention, and that's all a political call, essentially, at the end of the day, and a strategic call as to kind of what message you want to send to China in that regard. So that said, there are things you can do and things you can't do. China's a member of the WTO, we're a member of the WTO. It'd be pretty hard for us to hike our tariffs up on China without being sued in the WTO. So there's a limited range of things we can do. but certainly are some.
Well, the discussion of the TPP probably will not end soon, and
let's hope it does.
Yeah, but I don't think it will end soon, regardless of the result of the negotiation for the next few months. So, thank you very much for coming, and thank you very much, Dr. Beeman, for coming to the Tower Center. We have a lot more events this semester. Please visit the Tower Center webpage. There is an event page, and then you can register any event that you want to come. Thank you very much for coming, and please join me for applauding Dr. Beeman.